The sky above planet Xeron was always gray, thick with industrial smog that blocked out the sun. The air carried the acrid smell of burnt metal from the countless factories that lined the horizon. In the wealthiest district of New Xeron City, behind the marble walls of Lord Vextar's mansion, lay a secret that would haunt the dreams of anyone who discovered it. Deep in the basement, past corridors lined with exotic artifacts and stolen treasures, was a room that few were permitted to see. Here, behind bars of reinforced titanium, sat a cage barely large enough for a person to stand. Inside was a girl not human, not beast, something far more precious and far more tragic. Her skin was the color of burnt orange, marked with intricate golden lines that traced along her arms and face like living tattoos. These marks, once brilliant, now flickered weakly in the dim light. Her hair, once a cascade of silver that caught starlight, hung in matted tangles around her shoulders. Her body had grown thin from hunger, her lips cracked from thirst, her eyes hollow from despair. Lord Vextar, a wealthy Zeronian merchant with pale blue skin and predatory eyes, had purchased her 3 years ago from raiders who had destroyed her home planet of Liralai. He displayed her to his guests during elaborate dinner parties, describing her as a living gem from a dying world while she sat naked and shivering in her cage. "Magnificent, isn't she?" he would say to his visitors, tapping the bars with his jeweled cane. "The last of her kind, perhaps. Notice how the markings glow when she's frightened." Among his regular guests were Dr. Helena Voss, a human xenobiologist who studied alien species, Captain Rex Morgan, a gruff space trader who supplied Vextar with rare artifacts, and Madame Zephyra, an elegant Altarian diplomat who collected exotic pets. None of them questioned the girl's presence or her treatment. To them, she was simply another curiosity in Vextar's collection. The girl whose real name was Nera, though no one bothered to learn it, had stopped speaking months ago. She had screamed in the beginning, begged in her native tongue, wept until her tears ran dry. But silence had become her armor, numbness her shield against the endless parade of eyes that looked upon her as nothing more than an object. A tea night, when the mansion grew quiet and the guests departed, she would curl in the corner of her cage and remember. She remembered the green skies of Liralai, where 3 moons danced across the heavens. She remembered her mother's voice singing the traditional songs of their people, melodies that could make flowers bloom and hearts heal. She remembered running through fields of crystal grass, her golden markings bright with joy and life. Now those memories felt like dreams from another lifetime. The golden lines on her skin had dimmed to barely visible traces, a physical manifestation of her dying spirit. She had become what they called her, nothing, a thing, a curiosity to be observed and forgotten. But tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, a human named Darren would arrive at the mansion, and their eyes would meet through the bars of her prison. Tomorrow, someone would finally see not a creature, but a soul crying out for freedom. Darren Walsh stepped off the transport ship onto the landing pad of Vextar's mansion, his tool belt heavy around his waist and his mind focused on the job ahead. He was a construction engineer, tall and lean with calloused hands that spoke of years spent building and repairing. His dark hair was streaked with early gray, and his blue eyes held the kind of steadiness that came from a life spent solving problems rather than creating them. The mansion sprawled before him like a monument to excess, its white marble facade gleaming despite the perpetual gray sky. Darren had been hired to repair structural damage caused by the recent earthquake that had shaken the city. It was good work that paid well, and he needed the credits to fund his next expedition to the outer colonies. Lord Vextar greeted him at the entrance, his pale blue skin gleaming with expensive oils, his elaborate robes rustling as he moved. "Ah, the human builder. I trust you will be discreet about what you see here. My collection is unique." Darren nodded, accustomed to wealthy clients who valued their privacy. He followed the mansion's head servant, a nervous Zeronian named Crix, through corridors lined with artifacts from a dozen worlds. Sculptures of impossible beauty stood next to weapons of terrible power, all arranged with the careful precision of someone who saw beauty only in possession. "The damage is in the East Wing," Crix explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "The basement. Walls shifted during the quake. Lord Vextar wants them reinforced before his next gathering." They descended marble stairs into the basement, where the temperature dropped noticeably and the air grew thick with the smell of old stone and something else, something that made Darren's instincts prickle with unease. "Emergency lighting cast. harsh shadows on the walls, and the damage was immediately apparent. A long crack ran from floor to ceiling, threatening the structural integrity of the entire east wing. I'll need to access the adjoining rooms to assess the full extent, Darren said, examining the crack with his scanner. Crix shifted nervously. Some rooms are restricted, but I suppose, for the repairs, as they moved through the basement, Darren noticed doors that seemed out of place, reinforced, locked, with small viewing windows. The smell grew stronger, a mixture of fear and despair that he recognized from refugee camps and prison ships. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had learned long ago that asking questions in places like this rarely led to good answers. It was while examining a particularly severe section of damage that he heard a sound so soft it might have been imagined. A sigh, or perhaps a sob, coming from behind a locked door marked only with symbols he didn't recognize. What's in there? He asked Crix. The servant's eyes darted away. Nothing of concern, just storage. But Darren had heard that kind of nothing before. Against his better judgment, he approached the door and peered through the small window. What he saw made his blood freeze. A girl sat in a cage, her orange skin marked with fading golden lines, her body thin and frail. She was naked, shivering, her eyes staring at nothing. For a moment, their gazes met through the glass, and Darren saw something that would haunt him forever, not just pain, but a soul that was slowly disappearing. What is this? He demanded, turning to Crix. The servant backed away, wringing his hands. Please, sir, Lord Vextar's collection is not our concern. We must focus on the repairs. But Darren couldn't focus on anything else. That night, in his small quarters in the city's worker district, he lay awake staring at the ceiling. He had seen suffering before. The galaxy was full of injustice, slavery, and cruelty. But there had been something in that girl's eyes that called to something deep within him, something he thought he had buried years ago when his own family was killed in a corporate war. The next morning, he returned to the mansion with more than construction equipment. He had brought food, water, and a plan that would either save 2 lives or end them both. The morning light filtering through the mansion's windows cast long shadows as Darren made his way back to the basement. He had spent the night researching Lord Vextar, learning about his business dealings, his collection, and most importantly, his weaknesses. The Zeronian was greedy above all else, and greed could be negotiated with. Darren carried his tools as usual, but hidden in his work bag were protein bars, a water bottle, and a soft blanket he had purchased from a textile merchant in the city. First, though, he needed to complete his reconnaissance. He found Crix waiting nervously by the cracked wall. The repairs, sir? In a moment, Darren's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that made the servant step back. First, I need to speak with Lord Vextar. 20 minutes later, Darren stood in Vextar's opulent office, surrounded by trophies from a dozen worlds. The Zeronian lounged behind his desk, his pale blue fingers drumming impatiently on its surface. You wish to discuss something other than construction? Vextar's voice carried mild amusement. I want to buy the girl in the cage. Vextar's eyes widened, then narrowed. Ah, you've seen my prize. She is not for sale, human. She is the last of her kind, irreplaceable. Everything has a price. Darren reached into his jacket and produced a datapad. I have a ship, a Meridian-class explorer, fully equipped for deep space travel. It's worth more than most people make in a lifetime. The Zeronian's expression shifted as he reviewed the specifications. The ship was indeed valuable, worth perhaps 10 times what he had paid for the girl. But there was something else in the human's eyes, something that suggested this was more than a simple transaction. What would a construction worker want with such a creature? Vextar asked, his voice silky with curiosity. That's my business. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the desk. Finally, greed won over suspicion. Very well. The ship, and all its contents. Transfer the title to me, and she is yours. The transaction took 3 hours to complete, involving bank transfers, legal documents, and the exchange of security codes. During that time, Darren's mind raced with plans. He would need to get her off-world quickly, before Vextar changed his mind or discovered the true extent of what he had agreed to. Finally, with the key to the cage in his hand, Darren descended to the basement one last time. The girl looked up as he approached, her eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and exhaustion. She had been hurt so many times, betrayed so often, that hope had become a luxury she could no longer afford. Darren knelt beside the cage and slowly inserted the key. The lock clicked open with a sound like a prayer being answered. The girl pressed herself against the far wall, trembling. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly, holding up the blanket. "My name is Darren. I'm here to take you away from this place." She didn't respond, but she didn't flee when he opened the cage door. Moving slowly, with the patience of someone who understood trauma, he wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. She was lighter than he expected, her body frail from years of neglect. As he lifted her gently in his arms, she spoke for the first time in months, her voice barely a whisper. "Why?" "Because no one deserves to live in a cage," he replied. Together, they left the mansion behind. Behind them, Lord Vextar was already planning how to spend his newfound wealth, unaware that he had just traded away something infinitely more valuable than any ship, the chance to witness the rebirth of a soul. The transport to the spaceport was quiet. The girl Nara, though he didn't know her name yet, clutching the blanket around herself and staring out the window at a world she had never seen beyond the walls of her prison. Darren's ship, the Wanderer, was modest by most standards, but luxurious compared to a cage. He had converted the cargo bay into a comfortable living space years ago, complete with a small kitchen, a medical bay, and sleeping quarters with actual windows that looked out into space. For the first 3 days after leaving Xeron, Nara did nothing but sleep. Darren had placed her in his own quarters, the largest space on the ship, while he made do with the smaller crew cabin. He monitored her vital signs through the ship's medical sensors, ensuring she was stable while her body began the long process of recovery. He prepared simple foods, broths, soft fruits, water enhanced with electrolytes, and left them within reach. Sometimes he found them untouched, other times empty. Slowly, gradually, she began to trust that the food would continue to come, that she wouldn't be punished for eating. On the 4th day, she spoke. Darren was in the ship's small kitchen, attempting to cook rice and failing spectacularly, when he heard her voice behind him, soft, broken, like wind through shattered glass. "Why did you take me?" He turned slowly, not wanting to startle her. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in the blanket, her golden markings slightly brighter than they had been in the cage. "Because no one deserves to live in a cage," he repeated the words he had said before. "Do you want me to serve you?" The question carried the weight of years of conditioning, of being told that her only value lay in what she could provide for others. "No, do you want me to be yours?" There was fear in her voice, but also a kind of desperate hope that confused even her. Darren set down his cooking utensil and looked at her directly. "Only if you want to be." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for the lies she had learned to expect. Finding none, she took a tentative step into the kitchen. "My name is Nara," she said. "Hello, Nara. I'm Darren." That simple exchange marked the beginning of her real recovery. Over the following weeks, as they traveled through space toward a destination, Darren had chosen carefully a small moon called Haven's Rest. Known for its healing springs and peaceful inhabitants, Nara began to remember what it meant to be alive. She told him about Lirelai, her home world with its green skies and singing oceans. She spoke of her mother, Lirelai, who had taught her the songs that could heal wounds and mend broken hearts. She described the crystal forests where her people had lived in harmony with nature, and the day the raiders came to strip mine their world's core. Darren listened to every word as if they were precious gems, asking gentle questions that encouraged her to remember not just the tragedy, but the beauty that had come before it. In return, he shared his own story growing up on Earth, losing his family in a corporate war, choosing to explore the galaxy rather than remain trapped by grief. Nara proved to be brilliant, with an intuitive understanding of the ship's systems that amazed him. She had been a healer on her world, and her people's connection to energy and life force translated surprisingly well to understanding technology. Within days, she was helping him with repairs and maintenance, her hands steady and sure. She laughed when he burned the rice again, and the sound was like music returning to a world that had forgotten how to sing. He laughed when she called him soft like moon bread, comparing his gentleness to a delicacy from her world. They shared stories and comfortable silences, with no pressure or expectations. Darren never asked for anything more than her company, never pushed her to heal faster than she was able. He simply waited, patient as a gardener tending a wounded plant. One evening, as they sat in the ship's observation deck watching the stars stream past, Nara reached out and touched his hand. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact since leaving the cage. I want to be yours, she said quietly. Not because I owe you, not because I am broken, but because I have learned to breathe again, and you are the air I trust. Havens. Rest was a small moon orbiting a gas giant in the Kepler system, its surface covered in rolling hills and natural hot springs that glowed with a soft blue light. The settlers there were refugees from various worlds, people who had found peace in simplicity and community. Darren and Nera built a small home on a hillside overlooking the valley, with windows that caught the morning sun and a garden where Nera could grow the healing herbs she remembered from her childhood. The house was modest but filled with warmth, handmade furniture, wind chimes that sang in the breeze, and walls decorated with star charts and pressed flowers. They were married under the light of the twin suns that rose each morning over Havens. Rest, with only the wind and the light as witnesses. Nera wore a dress woven from starflower silk, her golden markings now bright enough to cast shadows in the sunlight. Darren placed a ring made from moonstone on her finger, and she placed a promise in his heart to walk beside him always. The people of Havens Rest welcomed them without question. Here, no one asked about pasts that were too painful to share. They saw only Nera's smile, her grace, the way she moved through the world with joy finally returning to her steps. Nera became a healer in the nearby village, using the songs of her people combined with the natural healing properties of the moon springs. Her patients came from across the system, broken bodies, broken hearts, broken spirits that needed mending. She saved lives, she mended hearts, and she was no longer the girl in the cage. She was Nera, the free, the strong, the loved doctor. Elena Vasquez, a human physician who ran the village clinic, became her closest friend and colleague. Captain Jonas Reed, a former military pilot who now ran supplies to remote settlements, became like a brother to Darren. Old Henrik, a Scandinavian farmer who had lived on Havens Rest for 30 years, taught them both how to grow earth vegetables in alien soil. Their happiness was almost too good to be true, which is perhaps why Darren was not entirely surprised. When Lord Vextar arrived one day with a small army of mercenaries, the Zeronian had discovered that the ship Darren had traded him was equipped with experimental technology worth 10 times what he had paid for it. Feeling cheated, he had come to reclaim what he considered his property. She belongs to me, Vextar declared, standing in the village square with his hired guns. I have the legal documents to prove ownership. But Nera was no longer the frightened girl who had cowered in a cage. She stood before him with her head high, her golden markings blazing within her fire, surrounded by the people of Havens Rest, who had come to stand with her. I am not yours, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had reclaimed her power. I never was. Vextar laughed, but there was uncertainty in his eyes. You are still just a creature, a thing, to be owned. Darren stepped forward, but before he could speak, Dr. Vasquez moved to stand beside Nera, then Captain Reed, then Henrik, then more villagers, until the entire population of Havens Rest had formed a protective circle around the woman who had brought healing to their community. She is not a creature, Darren said quietly. She is my wife, a healer, a warrior, a queen in her own right, and you are nothing but a shadow trying to steal the light, faced with an entire community willing to fight for Nera, and knowing that his legal claim would never hold up in a galactic court given the circumstances of the original transaction. Vextar retreated. He never returned. Years passed. Darren and Nera grew old together, their hair turning silver while their hands stayed warm. They told their story to the children of Havens Rest, speaking of freedom, love, courage, and how even in the darkest place, a single act of kindness could become a lifetime of light. In the evenings, Nera would sit by their window watching the sky turn soft blue and gold as the twin suns set. She would smile and say, once I was nothing, but now I am everything I ever dreamed to be, because someone saw me not as a prisoner, but as a person, and gave me not a command, but a choice.